Well, welcome everyone
to today's Peace Talks webinar, sponsored by the Universal Peace Federation. Also, the UPF has several primary associations that work with different sectors, one of which is the International Association of Parliamentarians for Peace, and the other is the International Summit Council for Peace, both of which are featured today. We have an extremely timely and important topic for today. It deals with the post-COVID time in the Americas. So we will have perspectives coming from North America, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, with some focus on development, economic development in the post-COVID era. Of course, we're still in the COVID era. We had a very, very useful discussion yesterday in a Peace Talks webinar on the future of the European Union and dealing with the future of such topics as multilateralism, problems of protectionism, the tensions between, let's say, the globalists and the nationalists on a worldwide level. Many extremely important, broad, contextual issues in terms of which we will be looking at the Americas today. We have an excellent panel of speakers. I'm looking forward to hearing from them, as I am sure all of you are as well. We have nearly 400 registered viewers for this Saturday program. All of the speakers will be speaking in English except for President Paz Zamora. Without further ado, it's my privilege to introduce Honorable former member of the House of Representatives for some 30 years, representing the great state of Indiana, none other than Dan Burton. He is also the international chairman of the International Association of Parliamentarians for Peace. He's our moderator for today's program. Honorable Dan Burton, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walsh. We really appreciate your leadership. And I also want to start off by saying how much we appreciate Dr. Hakshahan Moon's leadership in having these conferences around the world. She's probably the most diligent leader for peace I've known in my lifetime outside of people who are in public service. She's just a wonderful person, and I'm happy that she's doing all those things. Today, we have, as Dr. Walsh said, some very fine panelists, and I will introduce those just a second. But let me start off by saying the problems we face in this hemisphere, as well as other parts of the world, are very severe and extreme right now. The virus, of course, is very bad. We have problems with peace and war in other parts of the world. So this is a very interesting time. And today, I'm so happy we have some people who have great expertise in our hemisphere and around the world in dealing with these problems. So let me just start off today by introducing the people who will be speaking. The first speaker we will have, and I'll introduce the others as well, is His Excellency Anthony Carmona, former president of Trinidad and Tobago. We will then have His Excellency Jaime Pax Zamora, who was the constitutional vice president of the Republic of Bolivia and president of the National Congress down there. And then, of course, we'll have my old buddy and my good friend, my leader, Newt Gingrich, who was the Speaker of the House of Representatives when I served in the Congress, and he did an outstanding job, and he continues to do an outstanding job. I might just add that in addition to being Speaker of the House, he was also, which is quite an honor, he was at Time Magazine's Man of the Year in 1995 because of the work he was putting forth for the people of America. And then finally, we have my good friend, Dr. Michael Jenkins, president of the Universal Peace and Federation International, and he will be widening up our panelists. I'd like to just say to the panelists, I hope that you'll remember that we're on a time schedule. We'd like for you to keep your comments as close to 7 minutes as possible. And then at the end of our dissertations, we'll have a brief question and answer period. And you can even ask questions of the other panelists if you so desire. So let me just start off by saying I want to welcome His Excellency Anthony Carmona, President of Trinidad and Tobago, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, progressive post-COVID-19 sustained recovery can be realized through North-South, South-South, and triangular cooperation and collaboration. Caribbean countries ranked as middle-income democracies and as small island development states, even before pre-COVID we were already advocating for a better deal, a new economic order that would witness a change in the criteria to receive certain types of assistance that was not pegged to GDP, which excluded them from assistance and concessions. This approach ignored the special vulnerabilities of SIDS to certain types of natural phenomena like hurricanes and earthquakes, which could wipe out their GDP and set them back in terms of development by decades, which has already occurred in recent times. There's no real respite for Caribbean territories in the path of destructive hurricanes, which are increasing in intensity due to climate change, the effects of which place a disproportionate burden on SIDS. There has been much advocacy pre-COVID by SIDS for greater resources to be made available internationally to address climate change. Before the arrival of the first case of COVID-19, CARICOM countries have been using various multilateral and bilateral fora to call for rollback and understanding, lobbying for the region not to be cut off from the international banking system, from corresponding relations with the major private banks in the global north, which have threatened the banking system in our region. All we are saying is that we need the chance, a fair chance and a call for equity so that we too can achieve a 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Greater resolve is required for us to work together in a spirit of genuine multilateralism. The efforts of many countries to rally behind the World Health Organization with the pledge of hundreds of millions of dollars in the fight against COVID-19 are commendable. We must come together to work with the Pan American Health Organization so that this body can continue to assist entities such as the Caribbean Public Health Agency. The Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, has intimated a 4.4 increase in poverty, 28.7 million persons in 2020 compared to 2019. This is further exacerbated by a minus 5.3 economy retraction, resulting in over 12 million persons unemployed in the region. The global supply chains are floundering, and small fragile states are forced to look within, building on local capacity as the methodology for self-reliance and survivability. The new normal per COVID-19 is wreaking havoc on the tourist-based economies of the Caribbean region. Director of the Division on International Trade and Commodities, Ms. Pamela Cook-Hamilton, at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development revealed, and I quote, "The pandemic is also expected to have a longer lasting effect on global tourism than on other economic sectors. This is especially alarming for small island development states. The tourism sector is a significant driver of GDP and supports many other sectors directly and indirectly." The Operation for Economic Cooperation and Development estimates there will be a 60% decline in international tourism in 2020 because of COVID-19. This could rise to 80% if recovery is delayed until December. In short, they have stated that some of the suggestions that we can look at, and I quote, measures to ease illiquidity constraints of enterprises through sectoral funds, social security and fiscal payment, exemptions or deferrable fast and subsidized loans, sensible relaxation of regulations, and taxes on travel and tourism activities. There's no denying that diversification matrix is critical to the sustainable economics of SIDS countries dependent on tourism. I know, in fact, we are pressed for time, so I will be short. I will make my entire speech available. World Wide Web inventor Tim Berners-Lee has stated at the United Nations high-level meeting that the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrates the gross inequality of a world where almost half the population is unable to connect to the internet. He said, our number, and I quote, "Our number one focus must be to close the digital divide. This alarming disparity may have well been the reason many persons were not informed about COVID-19 protection protocols, for example, like social distances. Remittances in the Caribbean region has been grossly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic because of job cuts and restrictions. The World Bank report in 2015, the Dominican Republic receives most remittances by far, US 4.65 billion in total in 2014, Jamaica 2.26 billion. The United States is the main source of remittances, while in Europe, Spain 23% and Italy 21% are the main European sources of remittances. I wish to submit that the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Global Agenda, presents an ideal roadmap for post-COVID recovery. Apart from that, there is a very important issue that I wish to raise, and that has to do with the fact of lending and borrowing. However, I cannot forget that no one should be the universal, collaborative, successful attempts by doctors, nurses, and caregivers of all nationalities and religions aimed at saving the lives of those stricken by COVID-19 in the ICU wards of hospitals all over the world. I ask myself, why cannot we have a togetherness, a human economics, just as collaborative, just as inclusive, just as empathetic, just as solution-oriented as what obtains in the ICU hospital wards of pain, anguish, and sorrow? In dealing with and alleviating the COVID-19 epidemic fallout, there's an obsession with fixing now, not tomorrow, through excessive borrowing and debt augmentation. We are running the risk of creating an albatross on the backs of future generations. In the Caribbean, there is a sense that the world's richest nations have not responded in adequate terms to the declining economies of SIDS. The G20 countries, with great fanfare, have pledged to inject some $8 trillion into the world economy. What is ironic is that several of these G20 countries is in the Paris Club. The club has not been progressive, looking at debt relief in a progressive manner as we would have hoped. It is estimated, finally, that Caribbean economies have been so compromised by August 2020, there would be a loss of some 30% GDP. In this regard, the United States, the principal Paris Club member, and Congress can dictate the pace of progressive debt relief overall by holistic policies. The Federal Credit Reform Act of 1990 mandates that Congress must be involved in any official foreign country debt relief and notified of any debt reduction and debt renegotiation. Finally, the Paris Club is opposed to rescheduling of debt payments. And in this regard, what is required of this noble institution is not an institutional social responsibility, but rather an institutional social conscience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We really appreciate your comments. We will now hear from His Excellency Jaime Paz Zamora, the Constitutional Vice President formerly of the Republic of Bolivia and President of the National Congress.
Muy buenos días.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go directly to the topic we are invited to for this day. I want to start with my first thematic. I had a very interesting experience with Dr. President Bush because we were chairing a presidency at the same time. I was president from 1989 to 1993. So we started some kind of sharing experience of cooperation. We had some kind of interaction. So what we call a great presentation from the President George Bush to the solution of problems in Latin America. Now, looking at this moment, we can see that there is a very strong use for the problems we have.
Esta iniciativa de las Américas se basaba en 4 puntos. El primero, un tratamiento favorable nuevo, distinto al endeudamiento en el continente.
Primero, la solución adecuada. The first was the solution, adequate solution to favorable debt, external debts in the region. Second, the fortressing of inventions in North America and Latin America. Third, the opening of a North American market in the region, and also the fourth, the fight against the drug traffic. The results taken in Bolivia where these challenges are still alive during this post-COVID-19. With more actuality, this axis must be presented as a future proposal where we can include the cooperation, technological, and development for the environment. The second thematic is the American continent as a fact.
Segundo tema que quería decirles es que resulta que hoy podemos hacer
so we can create a new Pan-Americanism based on the new realities, objective realities we are facing now. We are the only one continent that it connects the two poles. We are the very planetarian axis between the two big seas, and so where all the commercial, the Pacific and Atlantic, where the Pacific is the great ocean from the future of our economy.
Y justo entre los dos mares estamos nosotros, el continente americano desde Canadá hasta la Argentina y el Caribe. Entonces, creo que esto nos da una base
we
para
are
poder,
a very good chance to take new actions to unify all the whole Pan-American thinking, so we can play that geopolitical role, bringing a geoeconomic, geopolitics, geocommercial, geocultural, uniting the whole planet. This is very important, so we can all of our agreements to become one big block, continental big block. So when we express our dreams, our hopes, then we can all take part in the dream of the other one. Because we are playing not only a national role or a continental role, but it's a planetarian role. I want to share a phrase. Love can be the most advanced technology of the 20th century first. But I'm talking about love. It's the highest technological item that we have for the future. In the Western world, we believe love is the highest expression. It's solidarity, it's cooperation, it's tolerance, fraternity, tenderness, playing together, helping together, sharing, reciprocation, so we can break down the chains of the puppies to the development of a human being. So we can avoid that the elements, external elements like China, can take, that will depend, that will become one unit. So we need to bring up our Pan-Americanism together. And so we will be very strong with for a new civilization, a new era, and a very strong, on top of everything, we must look at human development. On top of it is there are women, men, all together working for this. If we really create this new Pan-Americanism, this superior class, where we share love and values, we can become the hope, planetarian hope for the whole planet. So I wanted you to know, I wanted to bring my speech about these three topics. And so to refresh this agreement we had, this review of this agreement that we had with President Bush in the past. So it's very important to bring it out now. I really believe that we can bring up new values for everybody. This is my message for everyone, and this is my message. Thank you very much.
Excuse me, Mr. President. Thank you very much for your comments. And I wanted to apologize because I didn't mention that you were president of Bolivia from 1989 to 1993. But we really appreciate your remarks, and we'll get to the Q&A a little bit, and we'll listen to your remarks at that time. I'd now like to introduce my old friend, former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Mr. Newt Gingrich. Newt.
Well, listen, Dan, thank you very, very much. And I want to thank everybody who has been part of this. I also want to recognize once again the remarkable job that Mother Moon has been doing all over the world and the impact that she has had and the network of friends and parliamentarians. And I commend Congressman Dan Burton for taking the lead and reaching out to literally several thousand parliamentarians around the world. This is a really important time because we're beginning to look at the world beyond the immediate pandemic. And I think that what President Carmona said was extraordinarily important, and I want to reinforce it from the perspective of a former American Speaker of the House. This is not a time for institutions to behave as though the pre-pandemic rules are automatic, ironclad, and can't be changed. We have to have the same kind of flexibility with countries, particularly with poorer countries, that we have shown in the American system, with companies, with small business. I mean, we've rigged all sorts of things in order to get through one of the greatest crises that we have faced. The combination of the pandemic itself, coming out of China, and with people having been misinformed, so it got much worse than it should have, and the decision by governments to deliberately create a depression, something as a historian I've never ever seen before. Those two coming together, the public health and human cost of the pandemic, and the fact that so many places have stopped. I can relate directly to the challenge of the Caribbean because I am currently living in Rome, where my wife, Calista, is the ambassador to the Vatican. Last year, the Colosseum had about 23,000 people a day. For 10 weeks, it had 0. Now, the economic impact on Italy, when you go from 23,000 tourists a day in hotels, taking cabs, hiring guides, going to restaurants, and they disappear, has been catastrophic. The same thing, I'm sure, is true of virtually every one of the Caribbean countries who are so heavily dependent on tourism. And it's true to a lesser but real extent to countries all across the region. So I want to mention very briefly two things. One, I do believe there should be a reset in terms of debt payment and other activities after the virus is gone. And we should not accept the idea that these big old institutions should stay rigid and unyielding and try to apply rules that will simply bankrupt countries. I think we have to be flexible and creative, and it may require financing that extends the life of loans by a generation, financing that reduces the interest rates. I think we also have to think creatively about how to restart tourism so people can go back out. I can tell you in Italy, after a very brutal 10 weeks where everything stopped, the only things that were open were gas stations, grocery stores, and pharmacies. And if you were on the street without a legitimate excuse, you could be fined up to $3,200. So for 10 weeks, Italy stopped. In the last 2.5 or 3 weeks, it's begun to restart. Restaurants are opening, hotels are beginning to open, museums are opening. And so we're beginning to see it start. But until the airlines are able to make people feel comfortable flying, until the cruise ships are capable of making people feel comfortable getting on the ship, places like all of the Caribbean are going to remain in economic pain, and they have to be dealt with, I think, in a genuinely caring and humanitarian way. The other thing from our standpoint is, and one that I think all of Latin America should look at, we have gradually begun to realize how much the Chinese are using loans that ultimately bankrupt countries and are trying to move in with extraordinarily favorable financing. And the US government in the last 6 months has begun to really take seriously how we can do a better job of helping with infrastructure, helping develop technology, helping create jobs. And frankly, I think given the American interest right now in not being dependent on the Chinese economy, there's a great opportunity to dramatically expand the amount of investment in Central and South America so that we are able to manufacture right here in our own hemisphere. And I would hope that that is something which will be taken up in a very serious way and working together, that we will be able to actually create a much better economic pattern for the entire Western Hemisphere. And at the same time, if we can relaunch tourism, that will dramatically help. And then if we can have common sense, practical, humanitarian application of these debt agreements, I think we will get through the next 2 or 3 years and be in dramatically better shape. But I really appreciated President Camaro's comments, and I thought he was exactly right on target.
Newt, thank you very, very much. I'm sure there's a number of people who are watching today who may have some questions for you because of your position on issues around the world. I'd now like to recognize Dr. Michael Jenkins, the president of the Universal Peace Federation, and also a good friend. Michael?
Thank you, Congressman Burton, and thank you to Dr. Walsh and UPF for this great Peace Talk forum on the Western Hemisphere. We are encouraged by the remarks of President Carmona. I do believe that we want to increase the cooperation more than ever between all of Latin America, the Caribbean, and North America. I think that it's crucial that we realize we have a cultural common ground of our Christian heritage, the Roman Catholic heritage and the Protestant heritage. And we see that that is really the foundation for strong democracies, religious freedom, human rights. It also becomes a very base of family values, which I think that we want to commend all of Latin America and the Caribbean for their strong family values, which is also crucial to creating a very stable society and healthy, productive society. I also want to thank President Paz Zamora. Also, his cooperation during the drug war has been outstanding, especially during President Bush's time. And the U.S. appreciates his work in that area. And again, his call for cooperation. This whole Western Hemisphere is an enormous block of the world that has tremendous, tremendous power when combined all together. In 2018, there was $1.9 trillion of trade between the United States and the rest of the Western Hemisphere. And it was a positive development and continues to get stronger. So I think what President Carmona is also talking about, relaxing these rigid debt principles or the way we're working together has to change. It has to change. And thank you, Speaker Gingrich, for having the open mind to see that possibility of change. And you're a great influence to the American leadership in that regard. You've always been very open-minded to see how we can progress together, because we are one. We're not just isolated nations. We're all linked together. But in that area of debt and trade, I think that we're very concerned about what we see happening in Argentina right now. Argentina defaulted on its debt with China. And I don't know what the outcome is going to be of that and how they're going to work it out. But we have seen in other places like Pakistan where there's a default and China has become very rigid on controlling how the debt is worked out, and even claiming rights to property that they were working on together. So I'm very concerned, and America does have to step up its relationship, and Canada too, to support all of the South and Central, and also the Caribbean countries. I think we are really closer to one cultural family than the rest of the world. But 18% of the United States comes from Latin America and the Caribbean, and America has all those great American citizens here from your countries are great. Also, they have relatives, and they're great family people, and therefore we believe the collaboration can really open doors for much more progress as one Western Hemisphere cooperating together. So we thank you.
Well, very good, Michael. Thank you very much. And I want to thank all of our panelists. We're now going to go to the question and answer period. And I'd like to start off by saying, I was chairman of Western Hemisphere Subcommittee on the U.S. House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee for several years. And one of the things that I've noticed recently, and I'm sure the fellow panelists are aware of this, there's been some severe economic as well as other problems in Central and South America and the Caribbean, which has caused a migration of people into other countries. And as a result, that has added to the economic problems that have been faced by many of these countries, including the United States of America. So I'd like to know from any of the panelists here what you think might be done that hasn't been done to try to deal with these problems like we have in the Caribbean, in Venezuela, South America, and elsewhere. So if you have any answers to that, I'll direct this to any of you. And if you want to just chime in, I'd appreciate it. Newt, do you have any comments?
Well, I think that we have 2 or 3 times now started down the road of trying to develop economically Central America in particular. And I think that we really have to redouble those kind of efforts. I also think that in some of those countries, we have to provide a lot more assistance in dealing with security issues, including drug gangs and cartels and what have you, because some of these countries, I think, are literally incapable on their own of coping with the scale and the sophistication of modern organized crime. So, but I think it is absolutely an American interest to be a good neighbor. And I think all too often, we tend to get distracted into places like Iraq or Afghanistan and forget that we have this huge continent to our south. We have all the islands in the Caribbean, and that we have enormous interest in being mutually prosperous, mutually safe, and collaborating together. And I think that I would hope that we could be much stronger about that coming out of this particular pandemic.
Thank you, Newt. Anybody else have any comments they'd like to make on that? Because I think we're all affected in one way or another, many times adversely, because of the migration of people out of troubled areas. So any of my fellow panelists like to make a comment about that?
I am really, really, really heartened by the incisive sentiments expressed by Newt. Greenwich, Newt, how are you? It's good seeing you again, And you spoke about, in fact, the whole issue of crime. And I think it's important that we appreciate, for example, that there is need for greater hemispheric state participation in the United Nations Armed Trade Treaty as an important means of curbing the illicit trade of small arms and light weapons, as the COVID-19 pandemic has not witnessed a reduction in this pernicious trade. You see, what is taking place is I have found in relation to the United Nations Armed Trade Treaty is that there is a hemispheric implementation deficit and a participation deficit. And I feel in the circumstances that the gun trade and crime have militated against national growth and economics, especially in the small island development states. With regard to migration, I think, for example, from a Trinidad and Tobago perspective, given our very small population of 1.3 million, we have done quite well in accommodating thousands of migrants within the restricted budgets that we have. And in that regard, I think there is need for for more global intercession in the form of matter-of-fact remuneration to assist us in that regard. The bottom line is that the world make promises that we simply do not keep. Look at what has happened in Haiti, where 300,000 persons lost their lives. And do you know at least 70% of those pledges that were given have not been realized? And Haiti continues to be in a type of social morass. Another important feature in the context of ensuring good economics is by having the rule of law, by ensuring that due process and the rules of natural justice are followed by individual countries. Because it certainly creates an environment for economic development if you have a strong, independent judiciary. And that certainly can preempt the excessive migration that we often come across from countries where that facility is scarce.
Thank you, Mr. President. Kaylee, do you have some questions from people who are watching the program today that you may want to present to the panelists?
Yes, thank you. It's an honor to be here. We've been collecting questions from those who've been watching. So this first question is for everybody, and maybe we can start with President Paz Zamora. With the wealthiest countries, USA, Brazil, struggling to deal with the impact of COVID-19, realistically, what help can the smaller, poorer nations of the Caribbean and Central and South America expect? And this is a question for everybody, but if we could start with President Paz Zamora, we'd love to hear from you.
President Zamora, did you hear the question, sir? Well, if not, why don't we go to one of the other panelists and we'll get back to President Zamora, okay?
Well, certainly, if I may engage the particular question, and it has to do essentially with the observation made by Newt, to the effect, for example.
Yo sencillamente quiero incidir
Yes, we
en
hear
el hecho de que
Mr. President.
un nuevo panamericanismo supone una nueva.
I mean, what I'm talking about is a new, we need to be all together in the same, like North America, South America, Central America, and Caribbean. We need to see each other in a different way. So whatever we have been doing in the past. So we need to take a new initiative. So now we have a new homework to do. The health system. Why don't we have a health system, cooperative health system, not only for every nation, but for the whole continent, for the whole Latin America, for the whole continent, the whole region? Because you see, the whole planet was taken by surprise by this COVID-19 all around the world, and that was challenging the health, the world health system. So since we have been born in the same continental platform, so we really need to think each other as brothers and sisters. We need to look at the health and cooperation system as one thing.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, President Paz. President Carmona, did you want to respond as well?
Yes, certainly. I can tell you from a Caribbean perspective that we have indeed suffered from the vagaries of indifference and apathy from our traditional partners. And one positive thing about the COVID-19 pandemic is that it offers the opportunity to revisit and augment the economic relationship subsisting among us in a mutually rewarding environment. It is not an easy thing to come across a country that is often referred to as a first world country and that is buckling under pandemic. But you know what? A very strong statement was made in the ICU wards of America. when I looked and I saw persons of different ethnicity. I saw persons of different religion. I saw the big, the small, the indifferent. I saw everyone participating in a humongous struggle to save lives. And that is in fact why I feel there is a need for us to all bend our knees on the altar of our humanity, to engage a world that is progressive, holistic, and compassionate. And it is not about in terms of simply commiserating with the troubles and tribulations of the strong, but is also in fact a mirror in which we can look into to appreciate the need that we need to be each other's keeper, and that we can engage win-win situations in the context of world economics.
Kaylee, other questions?
Yes. So to all, starting maybe with President Carmona, since you spoke so much about tourism being important for Trinidad and Tobago, is it possible to diversify the economies of tourism-dependent nations to offset the decline of tourism?
Well, certainly, I think, for example, that there is a need for us to engage in more effective food security. And in this regard, in fact, it is very important that there is collaboration between the countries, the metropoles, and small island development states that exist in the Caribbean region. I can indicate to you, for example, that agriculture represents, in fact, a very important feature of any diversification process, because of tourism, and because, in fact, we haven't had the requisite resources. We have not diversified our economy in the manner that it should be. I mean, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, we were blessed with fossil fuel, when fossil fuel was the fuel that the world was subsisting on. Of course, that type of dependency must wane, because now, in terms of alternative energy, we have to look at alternatives in this country in the context of sustaining our economy. And in that regard, there is a lot of agricultural technology going on in America, where you find strains of seeds are improved and augmented to produce more fruits, to be more resilient. And more importantly, in our diversification process throughout the Caribbean, we need to look at the real specter of having hurricanes every single year. So it's not only a question of moving into agriculture as a form of diversification, but we need to also address what type of crops that we engage in, because we cannot, in fact, be planting back banana trees every year. So in that regard, I think it is a very, very forceful question. And it is one that throughout the Caribbean region, we are looking at issues of IT also. We are looking at issues of creating financial centers in the Caribbean region, all in an attempt to diversify our economy away from tourism.
Thank you so much, President Carmona.
I think we have time for one or two more questions, and then I'd like to go to the panelists and let them make a final comment or two before we wrap this up. So Kaylee, can you give us one or two more questions real quick?
Speaker Gingrich, recently you wrote a book about China. China has been very involved in the economic situation of South and North America. How do you see China's role in economic recovery in this hemisphere going forward?
Well, I think the Chinese are a two-edged sword. I think on the one hand, they bring technology and capital. On the other hand, they tend to strike deals which allow them ultimately to foreclose on the country. So for example, Sri Lanka lost one of its major ports, which the Chinese just took over as part of their negotiation. So I think in a way, you have to deal with the Chinese because they're a huge country with a big economy, but you have to deal with them very carefully and have really good lawyers, because if they can, they will consistently take advantage of you. And if they can, they will steal your intellectual property. But I want to go a step further in terms of what President Carmona said. we're going to have a different world coming out of this pandemic. And one of the big breakthroughs is going to be exactly what we're doing today. A scale of telecommunications and a scale of worldwide capacity to talk with each other that was theoretically possible 2 or 3 years ago, but most people never tried it. I suspect that 10 or 15 years from now, there will be several 100,000 jobs in the Caribbean with people who are engaged in work that is worldwide work based on very strong investment in infrastructure and the rise of 5G technology, which will make possible a huge amount of wealth development on relatively small islands in a way that would have been unthinkable 30 or 40 years ago. And I would hope, as we look at the development of the next 10 or 15 years, that we really place a substantial effort into the whole rise of wireless, internet, and other capabilities that eliminate distance and allow people to earn a living and get educated and have health care without regard to distance. So I'm an optimist about the potential that we have in the region.
Thank you, Speaker Gingrich. And one final question for Dr. Jenkins in light of all these important discussions. What do you feel UPF can do? What role can it play in bringing about these points?
Well, I'm very encouraged by what we see today. The International Summit Council for Peace, the ISCP, with the leaders that are represented here, Speaker Gingrich and President Zamora, President Carmona, and there are literally over 150 presidents that are now engaged, former presidents and many current presidents engaged from Africa, all over Asia, South America, Central America, Europe. It's really coming together in a very significant way. Prime Minister Harper from Canada has been very supportive. I think that leadership collaboration is what UPF is providing, a forum that also has been established in a way that allows very different opinions to come to the table without being combative or confrontational, and we build friendships. And that's what we saw at the World Summit. We saw incredible diversity, people who were the leaders of communist countries able to come in dialogue with Western democracies, and they somehow all seem to appreciate Mother Moon's gift of bringing all people together and showing that respect. The second aspect that I see, and I want to thank Dr. Walsh for this, is that the International Association of Parliamentarians for Peace, in other words, the presidents who are coming together here have a network of over 5,000 parliamentarians in over 150 countries. And now it's really starting to grow under Congressman Burton's leadership, and also Speaker Di Vinici, a former speaker of Philippines. That leadership is causing those parliamentarians to multiply, and they will be a valuable communication network for the presidents of ISCP too, because ultimately we need to go back to the parliaments and help those countries institute laws and agreements that will allow us to work better together and cause for mutual prosperity. And again, I want to emphasize this North-South unity that President Paz Zamora was talking about, Pan-America. I think it's very critical. I think of Catholics and Protestants, Jews, Christians, the religious freedom of North and South. If we really find a way to come closer together economically and also in terms of our values, which I think is very real, I think it has an enormous effect on bringing peace in Europe and also through the Middle East and throughout the world.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you.
Let me make one quick comment about the International Association of Parliamentarians for Peace. As Dr. Jenkins just said, we have 5,000 or 6,000 members already, and it is growing. One of the things that I think, in addition to the Parliamentarians for Peace working in their respective areas of the world to bring about peaceful negotiations and solutions to problems, is that we're all facing this pandemic right now. And one of the reasons we're facing this pandemic, it was well on its way out of control before everybody grasped the problem. And as a result, it spread very rapidly. One of the things that we have suggested to parliamentarians for peace around the world is that they literally keep their ear to the ground to find out if there's any other potential epidemics that might be starting or growing, so that they can contact other parliamentarians or our organization or the leaders of their country as quickly as possible, so we can nip those things in the bud. Once the pandemic gets out of control and it's spread from person to person, even people who don't know they have it, it's very difficult to control it, as everybody knows right now. And so the Parliamentarians for Peace, in my opinion, can be a real asset in getting the message out as quickly as possible if we see anything like this happening in their area or their country, so we can, as I said, nip it in the bud. We now have about 7 or 8 minutes left to go. I'd like to ask the panelists if they would be interested or willing to sum up and let us know if there's any final comments they'd like to make before we sign off today. So let me start off with, how about you, Newt? Would you like to make a final comment or two?
Well, I mean, I think all I want to say is that now is a time to have a big imagination, because we're going to go through tremendous changes, both on a public health side from the pandemic and on the economic recovery side. And we are learning both in things like, for example, the speed of developing new vaccines. We're learning in terms of things like the ability to use Zoom and go to meeting and what have you. There are a lot of things happening. And I think as a general rule, most of us who've been in positions of authority are probably too used to falling back on what used to work and don't take enough time to think about what could work. And I think we could be at the edge of one of the great periods of creativity, which would be almost a renaissance across the entire planet. And that's part of why I'm so deeply optimistic about the near future.
Thank you, Newt. President, either one of our presidents like to make a comment real quickly?
Yes, certainly, certainly. Economic recovery and development plans must be inclusive. I am of the view that women, young people, and persons with disabilities must have an input if we are to achieve real, genuine human development and economic recovery. You see, what is in fact significant is that when you look at the complement of persons on these various economic recovery teams, there's a dire lack of representation from those demographics. Finally, I need to indicate to us that young people are demanding a restructuring of the economic order. The classrooms of the world are boiling with militancy and advocacy, because children today and generations tomorrow stand the most to lose when human development is being outstripped by economic systems insensitive and indifferent to the fundamentals of human development and climate change. I think if we are to move forward, we must have an inclusive collaboration among all the sectors of our society, especially women, especially young people, and especially persons with disabilities, because we all know those are the segments of our society suffer the most when in fact there are dire economic straits. Thank you very much.
Thank you. President Zamora, would you like to make a final comment or two before we turn, and also you, Dr. Jenkins, before we turn this back over to Mr. Walsh, Dr. Walsh?
Simply, I want to say, I want to insist, we need a new Pan-Americanism. We need a new attitude. We have many factors. Even China wants to influence the world. Economical Europe wants to influence the world. We, as an American, we also need to do some part of influence to the world. So we have to show our own personality. And we need to talk about a new Pan-Americanism, so we can show that we are just one people, one block to the world, but with our own values. Pan-Americanism with new values, where human development and the take care of the planet are on the top of the main goals that we might look for.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dr. Jacobs?
Yeah, I want to thank you, Congressman Burton, and thank you to all of our panelists. And God bless South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and North America all together. Thank you.
Before I turn this over to Dr. Walsh, I want to congratulate Mother Moon on her new book, her biography. And I hope if any of you have a chance to read it, if you don't have a copy yet, you really should. It's very, very interesting. And with that, Dr. Walsh, we'll let you sum up. And if there's any additional things you'd want to bring forth, we'll be glad to hear it. And it's before you get it, I want to thank all the panelists, the two presidents, Newt, Michael Jenkins. You all did a good job. And Dr. Walsh, you didn't do bad either. Go ahead, Dr. Walsh.
I was a good listener. Well, there was a lot of good stuff to hear, and very, very inspired by this important discussion. Some key words that came out. I really liked the way Speaker Gingrich concluded with kind of the big imagination we need. I think that captures a lot, and a hopeful look that we are going to come through this with potentials and possibilities that we heretofore have not really even imagined, perhaps. And so I think this, while we face recession and pandemics, and that we do need to look beyond. I like Pan-Americanism that President Paz Zamora kept underscoring, and that resonates well, certainly with UPF's vision. And President Carmona talked about collaboration across all the sectors. That's exactly it. And Dr. Jenkins, he brought in this faith-based dimension. Very interesting, too, that Speaker Gingrich, an eminent political leader for decades and scholar and historian, and his wife is also an ambassador to the Vatican, which, you know, who more than Pope Francis is a great representative of how faith perspectives apply to the social order, the political, economic order, for moral guidance, providing a moral compass, as referenced earlier by the Moon's own leadership, other faith-based organizations coming together as part of this grand dialogue is also needed. So anyway, I just applaud everyone. UPF will continue this series. We have an important program coming up about peace in the Balkans, and then one in the Asia Pacific region that will take place in Bangkok, but will be heard internationally, of course, through our Zoom webinar series. I will conclude with that. I really thank you, Congressman Burton. You did an excellent job to moderate. You look handsome as ever, and you're a skillful moderator. And my thanks to all the panelists. You honor us with your presence, and even more so with your eloquence and your insight. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Have a nice day.
Yeah, you too.